positioning and several different types of it to see how we can use them to change the layout of our page, we're going to see how we can do that slightly differently with margins. So I'm just going to change our code, get rid of that big height there, and change the position here back to relative. So, as I hope you remember, that in itself doesn't make any difference, but you'll remember also that we can do things like this. Once we've set the position to be relative, we can set the left property to 100 pixels, and that effectively gives it a margin to the left of 100 pixels. So what's the difference then between using relative positioning and using margins? Well, let's find out. So first of all, you notice I've got rid of the positioning completely here. So we're not doing positioning, we're using margins. And initially I'm going to set the margin to 100 pixels. So what does that do? Aha, so now we've got a margin of 100 pixels all the way round the box. So we've got obviously at the top, left, bottom, and right. So hopefully you can see straight away that this is different to positioning. Even though the effect might be we're moving it to the right and down, we are actually creating a margin all the way round, which we can't actually do with positioning. Now, if we wanted our blue box here to be to the right of that, then we would just float them both to the left. And I'll just do that quickly to show you that we do indeed have a margin all the way round. So there you go. If we stretch that out, you can see we've got the margin here. And now, because these two are floated left, this blue box is now to the right of the green one, but it has this margin in between it. So that's the main difference really between positioning and margins. And you can use them in some cases for the same thing, but they are a little bit different. So let's just look at margins in a bit more detail and see what else we can do with them. So here we've got a margin of 100 pixels all the way around. What if we wanted to have a different margin on each edge? Well, that's pretty easy. We could have 100 pixels and then 50 pixels. Now let's see what that does. Okay, so that moves it over to the left. What we've effectively done there is we've set the top and bottom margins to 100 pixels, and we've set the left and right margins to 50 pixels. So if you want to pause the video and test by floating those two left, you'll see that the blue one ends up around there, so about 50 pixels to the right. So that's a really handy way of setting the top and bottom ones different to the left and right ones. But you could also set them all to something different. So let's have something like 20 pixels and 10 pixels. And then let's have a look. So what's going on here is this starts at the top and then goes round clockwise. So the top margin is 100 pixels up there. Then if we could see it, the right margin is 50 pixels. And then the bottom margin is 20 pixels. And then the left margin is 10 pixels. You might not be able to see that left margin very clearly. So let's just convince you by taking that back up to 100 pixels, and that now changes the left margin. So that's how you set each of the margins, top, right, bottom, and left individually. One last thing that you might want to do is only set one particular margin and leave the rest as whatever they are. And you can do that using margin dash and then bottom, left, right, top, depending on which one you want to change. So if we wanted to set margin left to be, I don't know, 150 pixels, then that will just set the left margin and it will leave the others as whatever they are. And that's pretty much it. So generally you would use margins when you wanted your element to remain in the flow of the page and to spread everything out relative to it. And you would use positioning if you wanted to take your element out of the flow of the page and move it around on top of other elements and that sort of thing. Very quick challenge then to give you an opportunity to practice margins. Can you take the blue div and make it so that it has margins of 50 pixels on the top and the bottom and 20 pixels left and right? And bonus points if you can do that in two different ways. So 50 pixels top and bottom, 20 pixels left and right. Go for it. Hope that worked out for you. I'm going to show you a few different ways to do it. In fact, there are 3 different ways. So the first one I'll show you is a single margin. So we said 50 pixels top and bottom and 20 pixels left and right. Let's have a look. There we go. So we've got 50 pixels at the top and the bottom and 20 left. And if we could see it, there'd be 20 on the right as well there. So that's one way of doing it. That's probably the simplest solution. Another solution is to set all of them manually like that. And if we just have a look at that, that does exactly the same thing. So that was solution number 2. There is, however, a third solution. So super bonus marks if you got this one as well. We could set the margin top as being 50 pixels. And then I'm just going to save my typing a little bit. Set the bottom to be 50 pixels as well. Could set the left to be 20 pixels. And of course, set the right to be 20 pixels too. And that's another way to do it, even though it's a little bit more long-winded than the first 2 solutions that we had. All right, so that's how we use margins to move our elements around the page. We're now going to see how we can use something very similar called padding to provide a much needed bit of space between the edge of one element and the beginning of something inside it. We'll be looking at that in the next video. Moment out to see how much you've learned so far in this section, because we really have covered a huge amount. We started off looking at what CSS was and why it was a good idea and how we could use it to style our websites. We then looked at both inline and internal CSS. Then we discovered classes and IDs to allow us to apply those styles to certain elements. Then we created some divs to contain our elements. And then we moved on to look at specific CSS properties, starting with colors and then looking at floating, positioning, and margins. So that really is a huge amount, and well done for making it this far and staying with me. We're now going to look at padding, which allows us to do something very similar to margins, but inside an element. And you'll be pleased to know that we've got just a few videos to go until we've covered the basics of CSS, and we're going to do our big website project. I'll tell you more about that later on. So padding is pretty similar to margins, but it works on the inside of an object rather than the outside. So if, for example, we wanted to have a little bit of a gap between the green text here and the edge of the blue div, we could, I'll just get rid of the margin there, we could add a padding of, say, 5 pixels. And let's now have a look. So that's quite nice. It gives us a little bit of spacing in between the edge of the div and the content. So a quick challenge for you then, could you set the padding within this blue box to be different? You can choose whatever values you like, but different on the top, right, bottom, and left. I think you can probably work out how to do that. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. It works in exactly the same way as margins. So we're going to use 5 pixels, 10 pixels, 15 pixels, and then 20 pixels. Let's have a look. There we go. Might not be that obvious, but we've got 5 pixels up here, 10 down here, 15 at the bottom, and then 20 on the left. It's worth noting that if we've specified a width, as we have here, the padding is on top of that width. So we've got our 400 pixels from, say, there to there, and then the padding, so the 10 pixels on the right and the 20 pixels on the left, will be on top of that 400 pixels. So quick question, what is the width of this box in pixels, the total width? Hope you got it. It's 400 plus the 10 on the right plus the 20 on the left, so 430 pixels in total. And that's definitely worth remembering. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you think that this is 400 pixels and then forget that it's actually 430. All right, so that's more or less all you need to know about padding. Just one more thing I'm going to show you. You may have noticed that there's quite a bit of white space that we haven't programmed into our page here, that's there by default. And browsers have default margins and padding built in to their elements. And that can make things a little bit tricky if you're trying to get a really pixel perfect design. So if you do want to do that and get rid of all of those defaults, then I would do something like, first of all, starting off with the body. So we're now styling the actual body of the page itself, and set both the margin and the padding to 0. And let's have a look and see what effect that has. So you can now see it stretches right to the edge of the page. You'll notice as well that we've got this gap between our divs here and a gap up there. If we wanted to get rid of that, then we would actually set both the padding and the margin for the paragraph tags to 0. So that's what's causing that gap there. So if we set both of those in, then everything kind of condenses up. So that might not necessarily be what you want, but we've achieved the effect of getting everything really close to everything else. As a quick aside, if you're getting quite excited about this and think you might get really into web design with CSS, then working with something called a CSS reset makes these things a lot easier, because these default margins that we saw over here can actually vary from browser to browser. So using a CSS reset in your pages makes those the same, so you can be more sure that your website is going to look exactly the same in every browser. So feel free to investigate that a little bit more. And definitely, if you're having issues that a website that you're making is different in different browsers, putting a CSS reset in there is probably a good idea. All right, so that's as far as we're going to go with margins. In the next video, we'll look at how to add a nice bit of styling to the edges of your divs or other elements using borders. See you there. On from padding and margins to borders. So looking at how we can give borders to our elements and what different styles we can use. All right, before we do that though, I'm going to give you a quick challenge because everything's getting a little bit complex here. So to make it easier just to work with borders, I'm going to reset everything back to 0. And then I'd like you to create, using just divs, 3 squares, 100 pixels wide and 100 pixels high, and make them red, blue, and green. So 3 squares, 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and red, blue, and green. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. I'm going to start with the HTML. And all we're going to need here is divs with IDs. I'm going to use IDs because there's only going to be one of each of them. And I'm going to call the first one square dash red. And then another one will be square dash blue. And the third will be, you've guessed it, square dash green. Okay, so obviously if we look at that, there's nothing there because there's no content. But we can add some styling to our divs, which will make them appear. So let's start with square dash red. So the main thing we'll need here is a background color of red. But we'll also need a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. There we go. Wonderful. There's our red square. So let's copy and paste that for our blue and green squares. Now they're going to be exactly the same, except they're of course going to be blue and green. Let's have a look. There we go. So we've solved the problem, but it's not particularly elegant. If I wanted to change the size of all 3 of these squares, as I might want to do, then I'd have to update all of those. Similarly, I don't quite like the fact that they're attached and I'd like to add margins to them, but I'd have to do that separately for all 3, which is not a great way to set up our page because it requires a lot of work to update it. So what I'm going to do is add a class of square to each of these divs. And then I'm going to put anything that's common to all three of them into that square styling there. So the main thing that's common to all of them is the width and the height. So I'm going to put that in there, and then I can get rid of it for everywhere else. All right, so let's have a look. Excellent. It's still exactly the same as it was before, but we now have two big advantages. One is that we have less code than we had before. Well, probably just about. But the bigger one is that I can now update of these squares with just one CSS styling. So as I mentioned, I'm going to add a little bit of a margin. Let's try 10 pixels just to spread them out a little bit. Yep, I think that looks better. Maybe even go for something like 40 pixels. Yeah. I'm also going to have them along the top for no particular reason, that I think that looks a little bit nicer. And I can do that really easily by just setting them all to float left. There we go. Brilliant. So I hope you managed that challenge, but also I hope it was useful to see the advantage of using IDs in some cases, but classes in another, to keep your code nice and easily updatable and changeable. All right, so now on to borders. So I'm going to do different borders for each of these boxes, and we'll start off with a nice straightforward one for red, and we'll have a 1 pixel black border. And we do that by setting up a border property, and then we have to specify 3 things. So the width of the border first off, so 1 pixel in this case, then the color of the border, so black in this case, and then the style of the border, and I'm going to use solid. There we go. So you can hopefully just about see that. Let's make it a little bit thicker. So we'll go for 10 pixels. And now you can really see it clearly there. So obviously you can change any of those. We could have a nice yellow border. We can change the width as we already have, and we can change the type as well. And if we want to get a list of the different types we can have, just Google border styles and then click on the top result. And you can see we've got solid, which is the one we've already used. But if you scroll down, then you can see all these different ones here. It's dotted, dashed, double, groove, ridge. So you can try all of these out. Let's have a look at double. There you go. So it sort of goes yellow, then red, then yellow. We can have dashed as well, which creates this dashed effect. And you're welcome to try out the other ones. To be honest, I don't use the different border styles very often. Solid is about all I regularly go for. Okay. Now we can do much more complicated things than that if we want to. So if we want to set, for example, the border to be different, top, left, bottom, and right, we can do that using border and then the various different options. So if we wanted to have a different style on top, left, bottom, and right, I've no idea why we would do that, but we might have border style, and then let's say start off with a ridged one, then a solid, then dotted, and then dashed. And just with margins and padding, this will be the top one, and then right, and then bottom and left. So let's have a look, see what horrendous border we're creating here. So you can see we've got some defaults of black and a certain width. I think that's about 3 pixels. We've got a different style on each one. So here's a challenge for you. Can you create it so that there's a different color on the top, right, bottom, and left as well? Go for it. Did you manage it? It's pretty similar. We just use border color, and then we could have green And then let's use a few of these example ones: green, beige, pink, and pale goldenrod. That sounds good. Wonderful. So now we've got different colors. It's looking horrendous, but it's a good example of what we're capable of. And then finally, I'll just set a different width for each one as well. And we'll do that with border width. And we'll have 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 2 pixels, and 1 pixel. And there we go. So it looks pretty horrendous, but it's pretty powerful as well. We can really customize this as much as we want. And just like with margins and paddings, you could set this one by one using, for example, border left color, border left style, etc. All right, so finally, look at a much nicer use of borders, and this is a border radius. So rounded rectangles are still all the rage, and they're really easy to create using border radius. So strictly speaking, this isn't really a border at all, but let's have a look. In fact, let's make it a little bit bigger than that. Have a 20 pixels border radius. What that will do, it doesn't actually add a border at all, but it adds a radius to the edge of our square, which, unlike our second example there, and really the first one too, does look quite aesthetically pleasing. So I'd recommend getting border radius into your toolkit as a web developer. Final quick border radius challenge then. Could you change this border radius style so that it creates a circle from this square? And bonus points if you can do it 2 different ways. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. All we need to do is set the border radius to half of the width of our square. So our square is 100 pixels. So if we set the border radius to 50 pixels, then the border radius effectively goes all the way from the middle of the top to the middle of the right. So we get a lovely circle. The other way to do it would be to set the border radius to 50%. And the advantage of doing it that way is then it will be a circle regardless of the size, because the border radius will always be half of whatever the width of the div is. So if we change the width of all of these, for example, to be 400 pixels, then you can see it stretches out the border radius all the way. And if the height was 400 pixels as well, then we'd get a really nice big circle. So you can use border radius to create circles out of squares. Wonderful. So we're now coming to the end of our CSS section, but we have a couple of videos before our big CSS project where we're going to clone the BBC News website. And those last few videos are going to focus on styling text with CSS. Of this section, we're going to be moving on from layout and color and focusing on text. So let's get rid of all our styles and indeed our content so far. And we're going to start by seeing how we can change the font or typeface of our text. So let's start by adding a little bit of text. I'm going to use the phenomenally boring, this is some text. But you can use something even more exciting than that if you like. Now, of course, to style that, probably the easiest way is to set up some styles for our P tags. And before I do anything new and fancy, I always like just to check that everything's kind of connected up right. So you might do something like font size 200%. And then just have a look. There we go. So this CSS is definitely connecting to this content. So even if I have a problem with my font changing CSS, I know that it's not down to an issue that I've spelt style like that or something like that. So that's a good trick that I always use before I'm doing something new. So changing the font with CSS is pretty straightforward. We use the property font family. Now the challenge with font family is that you have to remember what the font families are. Now fortunately, my text editor here has given me a few that I can work with. So let's go for fantasy to get something that hopefully will look completely different to plain old text. And there we go. You can see this is definitely a different sort of font than what we would have got without it. So now we've changed the font, but how do we know what fonts are available other than the ones that happen to appear in the drop-down list? Well, I would do a quick Google of web safe fonts. And then the top result for me is this w3schools.com link, which is perfect. And then this will give you a list of the fonts that are pretty safe to use. That means they're supported by most browsers. So we've got Georgia here, Palatino, Linotype, Times New Roman, and sans serif. That means without little ticks. So Arial, Arial Black, Comic Sans, etc. And a couple of monospace fonts as well, in which all of the characters have the same width. They're particularly good if you want to display code on your website. So you can try some of those out. Let's just pop on one. We'll try Arial, just because it looks different once again than what we have. So Arial. There we go. Let's refresh. There we go. So that's what Arial looks like. Now you'll notice though that most of these in fact have not just one, but they have several different ones. Most have three. So we've got Times New Roman, Times, and Serif. Now this is actually a really nice feature of CSS fonts, and it's known as fallback. So if the Times New Roman font is available on the system of whoever's looking at your website, then it will display the text with Times New Roman font. If not, it'll fall back to the Times font. And if it doesn't have that, it'll fall back to the standard serif font, whatever that is on the machine of your user. So if you're going to change fonts, it's always a good idea to have several different ones so that you can be sure that you're getting something that looks close to the font that you really want, even if they haven't got the perfect font already on their system. So you should always have several different font families, getting increasingly more general as you go across the commas like that. So that's pretty much it when it comes to web safe fonts. You'll notice though that there's not a huge number of these, and if you're really picky about what you want your website to look like, there might not be one there that's close enough to the vision that you have in mind. So I'm going to show you as well how to use Google Fonts, which is a huge range of free to use fonts that you can find just by Googling Google Fonts, and then click on the top result. It should take you to fonts.google.com, and Google Fonts looks like this. So it's really well organized. You can see how all the fonts look, and you can use categories on the left to identify particular types of font that you're interested in, and then you can use any one you like in your web pages. So there's a particular one that I like, so I'm going to choose the search option and then search for shadow, and this shadows into light font is the one I'm going to use. I think it's very nice. But the process of getting it onto your web page is exactly the same regardless of which font you want. So first off, just click the plus button and you'll get this little box appear at the bottom saying one family selected. You can select more than one if you want, but I'll just keep to the one. And then you can see we've got this embed font section here. So all we need to do is copy that code. We'll explain what it means in a minute. And then we go back to our HTML page, and then you can paste this in anywhere in the head section. It will actually work anywhere in the document, but normally we put our fonts and other styles in the head section. So you can see what this is doing is essentially bringing in a style sheet. That is some CSS, and it's getting it from this URL here, fonts.googleapis.com/CSS. And then you can see we've got what's known as a query string, that is a question mark, and then family, and then the name of our font family there. So that will bring in the font code to our page, but how do we actually use it? Well, to use it, we go back to our Google Fonts page, and then you can see here in the specify in CSS, we've got the CSS code that we need to bring that into our page. So just select that, Control C or Command C, and then we just replace our font family Fantasy, which is what we had before, to that code. Our font family is now going to be Shadows into Light and Cursive. So save that, go back over to our web page, and when you refresh it, you can see we've now got that very nice font. Excellent. So you can now add any font you like. Feel free to experiment a little and try out some different fonts from Google Fonts or elsewhere. But for now, we're going to move straight on to customizing text in more detail with styling text in the next video.